My point is we should be having a large and important conversation, and that should include the voices of the people, of civil society, of advocacy groups, and of folks who have interests that are different than the interests of governments and the interests of corporations, large and small.
You're listening to the Drone Radio Show podcast, the show about drones and the people who use them for business, fun, and research. Hosted by Randy Goers.
Hello, everyone. This is Randy Goers, and welcome to the Drone Radio Show podcast, episode 279. Do drones have a place in supporting social movements? For that question, we head to San Diego to speak with Austin Choi-Fitzpatrick, author, educator, and speaker. Austin's work focuses on politics, culture, technology, and social change. He holds concurrent academic appointments at the University of San Diego and University of Nottingham, and has been a visiting scholar at Oxford, the University of California at San Diego, and Yale. He is the author of several books and commentaries on social movements. His recent book, The Good Drone: How Social Movements Democratize Surveillance, shows how small-scale drones, satellites, kites, and balloons are used by social movements for the greater good. Politics and technology have always had a complicated relationship. Social media has upended assumptions about how politicians, voters, and protesters communicate. In this episode of the Drone Radio Show, Austin talks about the good drone and demonstrates the importance of technology to politics. But he argues we mustn't stop with social media. New technology in the air, like drones for example, change politics on the ground and democratize surveillance along the way. But before we hear from Austin, I want to thank those of you who are supporting my funding campaign. Whether it's $1, $100, or much more, you can help defray the cost of production and keep the podcast going and growing. Go to droneradioshow.com/donate. By the way, if you have an idea for a great show and want to share your experience, please contact me at randy@droneradioshow.com. So let's learn how drones can be used for social good with Austin Choi-Fitzpatrick. Let's pick up the interview where I asked Austin to introduce himself.
So I'm Austin Choi-Fitzpatrick, and I'm a professor of political sociology at the University of San Diego and at the University of Nottingham in the UK.
Austin, as a professor of sociology, what is your main focus?
Yeah, so I have a PhD in sociology, and I spend most of my time asking questions about what the world looks like and how it could be changed. That, in my world, falls under a large rubric called social movements. And so I spend a lot of my time thinking about and asking questions about, talking to other people about, reading books, writing books about social movements. And social movements are those times when people look at the world around them, decide that things aren't the way they should be, decide to get together to change them, and then do something about the world that they live in. And so this happens on the left, it happens on the right, it happens across the political spectrum. But what really it's aimed to do is to ask questions about how it is people working together make a difference. And it's kind of what brought me to this project, is asking questions about how technology fits into that set of activities that people are engaged in to make a difference.
And so you've written a book called The Good Drone, but that's only the short title. What's the full title of the book?
So the book is The Good Drone: How Social Movements Democratize Surveillance. And so I'm interested in the book and asking questions about what kinds of technologies get used by social movements and how that technology actually shapes culture and politics. And so if we have social media, for example, and people are increasingly able to spread the word about their event or to spread the word about something they think needs to get changed, social media has essentially transformed the ability that social movements have to get the word out. And so when I first started playing with drones, I realized that we're having a very important conversation over the last decade about how Twitter, for example, or Facebook is changing politics. But we hardly ever talk about this whole other set of technologies. So that's why the book ends up being called The Good Drone. Not just, there's a lot written about drones that points to their negative impacts, but I was interested in their positive impacts. That explains the first bit of the title. But the second bit of the title, How Social Movements Democratize Surveillance, also points to some of the impacts that new technologies are having, and not just sort of new social media technologies and smartphones, which are important, but as a separate thing from what I'm trying to draw attention to in the book.
As a drone user and experimenting with drones, when did you get the inspiration that you wanted to investigate drones more from a sociology perspective?
I was a professor living and working and teaching at a university in Hungary, and I was teaching a class called human rights advocacy or something like this. And human rights advocacy, don't tell any of my colleagues, I think is important, but sometimes the way we teach is boring. And so it's a class on, let's say, lobbying and how to write a strongly worded memo. And it's important stuff, and I really believe in it. But at the end of the day, I wanted to do something that I thought was a bit more interesting. So I told my students, let's have a pitch competition. Let's come up with some innovative things we can do in this class. We'll work as teams. I'll invest some money into this. So different people seeded different ideas about what we could be doing, and the range of ideas came out. And I said, what if we bought a drone, and what if we used it to estimate how many people show up at protests? Not to monitor the protesters, not to follow the protesters, not to sort of out them, but to just get a high-level view of how many people are at a protest. And so my students said, that's a great idea. So I invested some money. This was in 2014, and the Phantom had just come out. And so the first experiment was, what will happen if I, using my European debit card, buy a Phantom, from Washington State and had it shipped from Seattle to where I lived in Budapest, Hungary. Turns out that was possible. That was the first cool thing we discovered. This is when Parrot was everybody's on the, trying to get into this space. And we ended up buying a Phantom, and we ended up flying this Phantom around looking for crowds that we could film during protests, so we could develop a way to estimate the size of protests. Because remember, I'm a social movement scholar, and it turns out when only a handful of people show up at a protest, it means that protest probably doesn't have a lot of support. It's not the only thing it can mean, but that's an important thing. And if everybody turns out, especially if everybody turns out nonviolently, it means that a social movement has a lot of support. And these are important things for politicians to know. They're important things for the public to know, whether or not certain things in a democracy have support or no support. So that's why I thought this estimation idea was interesting. And in my little academic world, there's a whole bunch of stuff written about this. So it's kind of an interesting puzzle, both academically, but also for me as a geek who wanted to play with a new toy. So a handful of my students were wanted to do the same thing. So we bought this drone and we started documenting sort of large public events, but there weren't many large public events. And it just so happened, we bought this thing in the spring of 2014. And in the fall of 2014, Budapest, Hungary had the largest protests that the city had seen since the fall of the Berlin Wall. And there were these massive sort of groups of folks outside on the streets protesting, and they were protesting a tax on the internet that the government had passed. And the fact that everybody has the internet and nobody wanted to get taxed is why everybody turned out to protest. And so it wasn't a left-right thing, and it wasn't an old people versus young people thing or whatever. It was something that affected everybody. If you're a pensioner, you don't want to spend more money on the internet. If you're a university, institution, business, you don't want to spend more money on the internet. And if you're a young person, you don't want to spend more money on the internet. So there were lots of people who turned out. So the funny thing that happens then is lots of people turn out. We had our drone out documenting the size of these protests. And we were able to see what everyone else who was there could see, which is that tens of thousands of people had turned out, and they were turned out with strollers and with walkers and, with all, this broad demographics of folks. But then the newspaper the next day, which comes out with this sort of party line from the government, says that was a few thousand people, and it's the same old cranks and anarchists who are at it again. And we released footage together with an independent journalism outfit that showed, from the air, that there were tens of thousands of people there. Another protest was organized a couple of weeks later. It was even larger. We documented something like 60,000 people had shown up. And that's what took this from being this kind of cool, fun experiment with my students to realizing, oh, this is actually a powerful tool to tell a very different story about a very important political moment. And a week after that second larger protest, the government gave up on this. The protesters declared victory. The tax was never passed. And then the footage of that, of sort of all of these folks having turned out in this way, ended up in the Financial Times and the International New York Times. And it struck me that one of the important parts of the story was the internet and attacks on the internet. But another important part of the story was that something like 100,000 people viewed our footage that we had shot from the air that showed everybody who was on, what everybody on the street already knew, which is that there were tens of thousands of people. And in one last little twist, and I'll finish my story with this, it turns out that for public policies to really change and protests to really move the needle, something like 3.5% of the population needs to turn out on the streets non-violently and say, we are not down with whatever the thing is. So we ran the numbers, and it turns out that what we had documented, again, using this drone footage from this old 2014 DJI Phantom, was that something like 3.5% of the population had indeed turned out, and the people indeed were victorious in what they were demanding. And what they were demanding is no tax on the internet. So it's kind of an apolitical issue. So in that moment, I realized, oh, wow, this is not just a story about the internet, not just a story about cell phones and social media. It raises important questions about how new technology in the air can really change politics on the ground. And as I say in the title of the book, it can really democratize surveillance, because it was sort of we the people who had the eyes in the sky, as it were.
I think most people like the idea of democratizing data. It's the surveillance part that usually draws a negative connotation. How is democratization of surveillance a good thing?
The question here is democratizing surveillance a good thing? And I think that it would have been different if I had called the book How to Democratize Accountability, right? Or how to democratize a world that's safe and free for all. But really, the word surveillance gives us pause, as you've pointed out, and it should. Because in the book, I make the argument that governments all over the world, I'm living in the United States, I work in the United Kingdom, in both countries, the government has reserved the right to fly drones, fly helicopters, fix all sorts of fixed-wing aircraft, and to surveil. And so the United Kingdom has more CCTVs than any other country in the world per capita, to the best of my knowledge. So in both places, the state is able to use drones, is able to surveil citizens. And certainly here in the United States, there have been advances in corporations being able to use UAV and UAS technology for delivery and for first responding and for all sorts of agriculture, this sort of thing. All the other, I listened to your show, the sorts of guests you have are oftentimes in that commercial space. So we have the state, the government's in that space, we have private actors and corporations are in that space. And what I'm trying to say is that the people should be able to be in this space as well. And that if we're going to say that the government and only corporations can be in airspace with UASs, then that's one conversation. I don't want to live in that world, though, where only governments and corporations have power over a particular technology. I'd rather we had a robust discussion about what it would look like if we had more democratic access to the sky. Now, my point isn't everyone everywhere should be doing the same thing. My point is we should be having a large and important conversation, and that should include the voices of the people, of civil society, of advocacy groups, and of folks who have interests that are different than the interests of governments and the interests of corporations, large and small. And so the democratize is really about, well, what about the people? And what happens if the people have this technology? And what would it mean if we had some bit of the sort of the sky that was set apart, or this bandwidth, that's set apart for the people? And that's not really the conversation I think we're having in a robust way in the States. Now, it may be that when we have that conversation, people say, I love that democratize thing you just said, but can we talk about the surveillance in that democratizing surveillance sort of phrase? And no, we do not want these technologies in the air. I'm okay with that too. Even though I give a lot of positive examples of the use of UASs in the book, I do think there's every right for a community or a country to say we'd rather the government and corporations and everyday citizens did not have access to this technology because it's all surveillance. I'm okay with that. I just think we should have a robust conversation that includes the people, we the people, and not just corporations and governments.
Is that the primary reason for writing the book?
So I had two real objectives with the book. One is to say to my colleagues in the social movements world, hey, we're really interested in the important role of technology in protest and in politics, but we've been focusing only on cell phones and Twitter. And we should really be focusing on a whole new range of technologies in the air. And I focus primarily on drones, but I have case studies with using balloons. I own balloons and kites, and I've tied GoPros to them and flown them in all sorts of situations, trained activists on how to use balloons and this sort of thing. And satellites. So we've got drones, satellites, balloons, and kites, all of them. Some of them are new, some of them are old, but are able to help us develop new tools for seeing things from the air. And my argument to my social movement and sort of academic colleagues is, let's not just focus on the importance of the internet and social media. Let's look at all these other technologies and the impact they have on culture and politics. But then also say to the general public, while most of us are rightly freaked out about, whether or not a drone is going to fly over our backyard, the fact is that's not how most drones end up getting used in the hands of our friends, neighbors, and people who aren't these corporations and governments. With my students, sat down and we scraped the web for all mentions of sort of small drone use. So not fixed wing weaponized devices in sort of the Middle East, but the kind of drones that I'm talking about right now. We looked from 2009 to 2015, and we got about 15,000 reports. We analyzed all those reports, and what we came out with at the other end was about a little bit over 1,000 discrete uses where we could identify who the user was, what they were doing, why they were doing it. And when we analyzed it, we found that out of the 15 or so different types of use, the two smallest, least likely types of use were to spy and to break the law. And so while it hits the news every time a drone tries to drop, contraband into a prison or jail, and it's led to a whole bunch of sort of airspace denial technology and innovation in that space, which is great. While that stuff makes the newspaper, what tends to not make the newspaper as often is all the other times that people are using drones and trying to test at the edges of what they can do with an eye toward either personal enjoyment or toward the greater good. And what really shocked us in the data is we analyzed these 15,000 reports, these 1,000 unique cases, going all the way back to the early days, all the way back to 2009. And the thing that is in the newspaper the most, and the thing that we are all the most concerned about, which is crime and surveillance, peeping toms, and these sorts of things, were actually the least prevalent in our findings. And so one instance may have generated 150 news stories, but if it was only one instance, we only counted it once. So we essentially ignored how much attention it got and asked, how often does the activity really happen? So to answer your question, two big messages in the book for all of my colleagues in the social movements world: hey, look at this new technology. And for the public to say, actually, this technology, which we are all looking at and talking about, is more often used for good than it is for bad. And not just by a little, but by a lot. So the order of magnitude of positive use is far higher than use for, again, for spying and for crime and that sort of thing.
Who do you think would find the most interest or the most value out of reading your book?
I think folks who are interested in protest, politics, culture, social movements is one whole category of folks. The question is, how is it we make a difference? If you want your voice to be heard in a world where your voice isn't heard, how do we raise awareness about the things that matter the most to us? And I think that is a community that tends to ask questions about awareness raising and about getting their message across, and that's really important. But one of the things I show in this book is that we need to also focus on technologies that make the status quo more expensive, make it more difficult for business as usual to continue. And again, this is the sort of thing that really has occupied the interest of both scholars of social movements, but also people who want to make change, right? I mean, that's what Call Your Congressman is about, right? Jam up your congressional representatives' phone lines, make it so that their phone lines don't work and they might listen to you. That just makes it harder for them to do business, whatever your issue is. It's not a left-right thing. It's a making it harder for whoever it is that you're trying to target to do business as usual. And that's exactly how we used this drone. We made it harder for the government of Hungary to say there was nobody at the protest. We made it hard for them to say that because we had other facts. So I would say anybody who's interested in society, culture, and politics and change should be interested in the book. But then especially in terms of, I'm mindful of the fact that I'm on your show. I think if we want to see a one-stop place where we can see the really great things that drones have been used to do captured in one place, this is the book. And so I really have case studies of case after case, instance after instance, where drones, and again, throughout this conversation, when I say drones, I really do mean quadcopters, octocopters, small platforms run by people in the really lightweight class. And I'm talking about hobbyists, enthusiasts, and also more sophisticated actors, but who are using relatively accessible technology. So all of the ways that whole set of actors are using UASs to really make the world a better place. And I think I hope this book becomes the one-stop shop for folks who want to point to the technology as a force for good and to say, okay, there's a downside to everything, but let's look on the bright side and take a look at all the examples that the book has to offer.
Okay, so let's talk about the book. Maybe you can start by going through how it's organized. You don't have to go through all the details of the book, but give us a sense of how the book flows.
Yeah, so I really spend the first bit of the book making the argument that I've made over the last couple of minutes, which is that we need to think about technology in a broader way. And when we think about technology in a broader way, there's a better story. That's, the first third of the book really is making that argument. So I move then from that beginning to then ask a question about where is it that balloons, drones, kites, and satellites really came from in their history. And I write a history of how they've been used for good. And I track, the balloons were being used during the Civil War and they're being used for good. Kites have a long history of being used for scientific experimentation and this sort of thing. And I sketch what I think might be an alternate history of the drone. For this book, I interviewed Abe Karem, who very famously is the father, the drone godfather he's been called, because he invented the prototype of what would become the Predator. And I drove up to his office and I sat down and I interviewed him. And what came out, which is a story that I tell in the book, it's a very different perspective on how he was thinking and what he was really having in mind when he invented the Predator. He came from Israel and came to the United States and has this kind of classic research and development in the garage story. And I don't want to say rags to riches, but this really amazing story. So I capture his story in the book and tell the story of the early days of the drone that would later become the Predator and how it actually was used to support human rights efforts in Kosovo and the Balkans back in the 90s. That's when the CIA first started deploying it. So while the book is not about fixed-wing aircraft and is not about these large, Predator-sized drones, I do kind of go back and take a look at that story and ask what would have happened if that set of fixed-wing technologies were used for a bit differently than they've been used in wars over the last 20 years or so. And it's an alternate history, perhaps, of those drones. So then I go on. So I talk about the history of these things, and then I actually ask new questions, I think, about if we have drones in the air, how would we deny airspace to them? And how do we pass laws that might support or discourage their use? And some of the folks you've had on this show have companies that are working on airspace denial and risk mitigation. So I survey some of those technologies and talk about that. And then I really finish the book by asking really big questions about how is it that new technology gets adopted and spread? And the question there is really, I'm saying, hey, you know what, there's a good drones out there and we should be using them more broadly. Will that happen? And that's an open question in my mind. I honestly think that when I first bought that drone that I described to you in 2014, I thought, wow, in 5 years, the world is going to be a really different place. And here we are 5 years later, and as I listen to your show, I see we're continuing to make progress on, airspace denial and on more sophisticated technologies, but we don't live in a world where there's delivery drones. We don't live in a world where there's ubiquitous, reliable, networks of drones that are delivering services and fitting into existing infrastructure. So maybe that's 5 years out, maybe that's 10 years out. But as somebody who started this journey about 5 years ago, I thought we'd be further along. So I ended the book with this puzzle. How is it that technology diffuses and spreads? And how is it that it actually gets picked up, adopted so that it becomes ubiquitous, not just a sort of a one-off experimental thing, but something that really does enter into our infrastructure and into our daily lives.
Which is your favorite chapter?
I didn't mention it just now, but I have a degree in photography. When I was an undergraduate student, I studied photography. And one of the things that's captured my attention about drones is the way that they allow us to, lots of different sensors, but they really allow us to see things from new perspectives. And I'm really fascinated by the way that camera technology has sort of co-evolved alongside of drone technology. So all of a sudden, we have a new range of faster processors because of mobile phone technology, range of faster processors that are allowing us to do more things with how drones are controlled, but also allowing us to put way more sophisticated imaging technology onto drones. So I write this history that maybe I'm the only one who loves it, and I only get to talk about it because you asked me what my favorite chapter was. But I love this chapter because I talk about how the camera started out as architecture. Thousands of years ago, there's a pin, like a pinprick in the side of a mud hut. And if you go inside, it's a camera obscura and it flips the image and you can go in there and see it. So the camera starts out as architecture, and you fast forward a couple of thousand years and we develop camera technology, which we would recognize, but it has to be on a tripod. And then it advances to the point where film speed and shutter speed are fast enough that we can hold it in our hand. And then the last step, and this is the one that really ties it into the larger story of drones and UASs, is cameras are now out of our hands. They're now in the air. You can program your drone to go someplace and take a photograph and come back, or film continuously along a route that's pre-programmed. And that's happening without us. We can program these coordinates and let the drone off to do its thing. This is even happening at the level of focusing. So there's new developments in what we call artificial intelligence generally, but it's a host of complicated technologies working together that ensure that a camera is taking 3 or 4 different photographs simultaneously and then presents the one that's best to you. And so all of a sudden, what was architecture and then a tripod and then handheld photography is now something that is out of our hands. The lens is flying off on its own platform and taking pictures that we might not even be pressing the plunger, for, or setting the timer for. It's just out of our hands. So that's my answer to your question. My favorite chapter is this little love story to the camera, because I really love camera technology, and I'm amazed at how far it's come in just 150 short years.
What about the most challenging chapter for you to write?
Oh, that's a great question. The most challenging chapter for me was to really dig deep into the history of these 4 technologies and to ask where to start the story. Because as it turns out, humans have been really experimenting for millennia with these sorts of things that we only do much later on. So Leonardo da Vinci has drawings of people flying, and it was hundreds and hundreds of years until we really were able to do that. So teasing out those stories all the way back to the beginning was hard. So the kite, for example, turns out it's the kite of these technologies: drones, satellites, balloons, and kites. Kites have the earliest history. They were invented in China, as best we can tell, but we don't quite know by who or for what reason. And then I spent this is the stuff authors love to talk about, maybe nobody else likes to listen to, but I spent a whole week trying to figure out where the real origin story was for the kite. And it was either a farmer who had his hat clipped to the lapel of his shirt in like 2000 BC, and the wind blew his hat and flew there, and he thought, oh my God, this could be a kite. Or he thought, I don't know, I could do something with this. It was either him, or it was a story in which kites were used in war, and they were used to actually monitor the opposing force's troop size. So either it started with a gust of wind off of somebody's head, or it started during a battle as a sort of a key tactic in assessing the enemy's strength. I don't know which it is. And so what's kind of frustrating, but I have to admit also fun, is figuring out how you're going to start the story. Which of those is the real beginning? And sometimes we can trace it back to, trace drones back to Abe Karem, and you interview the guy who invented the Predator. That's not too hard. But if you go back earlier than that, 3,000 years into the past, things get a little bit dicier.
Which chapter do you think readers will find most fascinating?
I shouldn't say this because it's just too nerdy, but I wonder sometimes if readers really know which thing the author loved the most based on the writing. And so the thing that I just really left my heart in is this little picture of the camera, asking, where does the camera go next? It's out of our hands, and it's all grown up now. The camera's all grown up now. And so that's the one that my heart is in the most. But the one that I think is the most sort of engaging, and I think is going to capture folks' imaginations, I hope, is the chapter where I do this history and just kind of take this really big look at where did we get drones, satellites, kites, and balloons for the greater good, being used in order to make the world a better place. That's one chapter. And another one, which I haven't mentioned, I think, is talking about what having new technology in the air means for art. And so it turns out, again, this is like another thing I didn't know about till I started the book, is it turns out that there is a whole movement of artists that wanted to get out of New York, because forget New York City and its hoity-toity sort of fancy exhibitions and curators. We're going to have an art movement that goes just out. And they started doing art in like outside spaces. And in some cases, they did art that can be seen from space. And so I started writing about these artists that were doing land art, big, large form land art, sort of very glorified crop circles out of stone and water and all this sort of thing. And I'm thinking, why are they doing this? And the only reason, I shouldn't say the only reason, artists have lots of reasons, but the reason I can think of is you can see it by satellite. And it got me thinking, well, what if there's no satellites to see your art? And it turns out that if you dig far enough back, there's these things called the Nazca lines in Peru, which nobody knew they were there until, about 100 years ago. We sort of discovered that West kind of like stumbled upon them and discovered them again, even though they've been created thousands of years ago. And they too can be seen from the air. So all of a sudden, there's this weird story where having new technology, where we can see from new places, got cameras in new places, allows us to do really different and interesting stuff on the ground. So all of a sudden, we ask people not to graffiti on the sides of buildings, but maybe we give them roofs to graffiti on. Maybe rooftops become the new site for graffiti because they can be seen by drone. And maybe in an era of COVID, I could say, sign up for the drone tour of, I'm living in San Diego right now, sign up for the drone tour of San Diego, and you log in on Zoom and you fly over the buildings, and on top of every rooftop is a huge mural. I mean, that's not a thing. I didn't describe a thing. It's not in the book because it's not really a thing that I know of. But we can imagine that kind of creative work happening because of one simple reason. Not that NASA has satellites or Google has satellites, but we can, without too much expense and fuss, have drones in the air. Now, harder to fly through downtown San Diego, but you see my general picture. So anyway, the punchline is, I think that's a chapter that might engage folks and capture the interest. Certainly caught my imagination, and I learned a whole bunch of stuff I never knew about art scenes and people trying to get out of New York City.
Now, your book focuses on the good aspects of drones and what they can do, but there's always the other side. Do you spend any time on the potential nefarious uses of drones?
It spends less time on that because I feel like there are so many folks writing and working, and in some cases worrying about that. It's not an issue that we should dismiss lightly, but it is something we should take a measured approach to. And that's part of why I gathered all this data about how drones were actually being used. I didn't sit down with a particular political approach to say, what do I want? I sat down and said, what are we even doing? And this led me to feel, and I don't know if this is true, but your listeners will have their own opinions. I really believe that most people don't want to be bad, and most people don't want to break the law, and most people want their neighbors to think that they're okay. And most of us do the right thing most of the time. And so to build laws around the worst case possibilities is, in my estimation, not the right move. Now, if it turns out none of us can be trusted with drones because we're just so dang evil and mean and creepy to each other, then we need to have a real conversation based on those facts. But I don't want to say until that happens, but if that's not the thing that's happening the most often, then why should we litigate or why should we legislate around our fears? And so maybe I'm just a little bit too much of a libertarian, but I really feel like if we're going to pass laws that make it possible for governments have this power and corporations have this power, and we're afraid the people might not be able to handle this power, I don't like that world. I don't want to live in that world. I'd rather live in a world where we wait and see, and we wait and see whether or not the market comes up with solutions in the form of airspace denial technologies that you've had folks on the show about. Let's wait to see if there's not communities that come together that say this is a no drone zone, or if local governments don't step in and say, here's our policy on this. And so I understand the FAA's need to have a coherent national policy. So I'm not trying to, I'm not a legal expert. And my point isn't to sort of get into a square off or a debate about that, but it's to ask us to step back and ask, what kind of world do we want to live in? And I think the world we want to live in is one where there's innovation and creativity. And if we need to sort of turn down the dial from time to time and in place to place, we do it at the right time and at the right place based on that bad behavior, and not sort of with a blanket ban. And I say this because, to return all the way back to the top of this conversation, I say this because after we flew the drone in those protests that I described in Hungary, the government's case for that new tax collapsed. And they failed, and they were humiliated, and it was the cover of the International New York Times, all these tens of thousands of people that had turned out. But about 6 weeks later, I got invited to an invitation-only conference on drone technology and drone regulation. I was invited to be a panelist in all of this, and I didn't know what it was about. And it turns out the entire conference was only meant to do one thing, which is to announce that the Hungarian government had a new law. And that new law was that nobody that's not the police can fly a drone anywhere where there's a police activity, police events, public engagement, or any sort of like large crowd. So if you step back, you think that's smart. There shouldn't be drones flying over the crowd. And you also think that's smart. There shouldn't be drones interfering with the police activity or with firefighters, for example, which is, we have cases of here in San Diego where I live. That's actually smart uses, but they used it as a blanket ban in order to ensure that they were never embarrassed in this way again. So I'm not arguing for against laws. I'm arguing for their smart application when it becomes time, when it's important to protect safety, protect people's privacy, and to protect the public good. I just want to make sure we pass laws that are intended to protect the public and not just save a government from embarrassment, as the case was in Hungary, or to make sure that it's only corporations that can benefit from new R&D, which may be the case in the US. I don't know. So anyway, I spend less time talking about the bad actors because I feel like we know a lot about them, and we know a lot about them just intuitively. We sort of have fears. But if we start with the facts, I think we're going to build better public policies, and facts should better inform public opinion.
How long did it take to write the book?
Longer than I would like to ever admit. I started this question really with the purchase of that drone back in Hungary in 2014. By the time 2015 rolled around, I realized, wow, nobody else is really talking about this. By 2016, 17, I was talking about it. By 18, it was with the publisher. And then it takes a year and a half of all sorts of, stuff for a book to finally come out. So book took about a year to write, and a year to get started, a year to write, and a year to kind of polish and finish off. So 3 years plus noise.
Did the final version change much from the initial concept?
One of the things that happens with books that are trying to tackle sort of complicated puzzles is you get a lot of feedback from people that say, well, what if you thought about it this way? And so I think that the book's main arguments are intact, but my response to feedback was, maybe it's patting myself on the back to say generous. When people said, I think there's another way you can look at this, I took that seriously. And sometimes that sent me back to the drawing board. So for example, I've been talking in this conversation about drones, satellites, kites, and balloons. And when the book first went to my editor, it was about drones and satellites. And she said, wouldn't it be interesting if you talked about kites and balloons? And I said, oh, Lord. Okay. So I fired up my book order form, and I dusted off my library card, and I got 150 books on all that stuff. And I made myself a person who now knows something about the early history of kites and balloons. And it was rewarding in a lot of ways, because otherwise I never would have known that kites either came from a new war tactic or new battle tactic, or from somebody's a farmer's hat blowing off into the wind. So you'll learn things along the way, but there's certainly all these opportunities to incorporate folks' feedback. And sometimes you take it and sometimes you don't. In every case that made the book a little longer, or made it longer to write, is because I thought it was additional worthwhile information to have in the book.
How did you do the research for the book?
There's two major sources of data in the book. And one of them is, as I mentioned earlier, these 15,000 reports of drone use between 2009 and 2015, 16, early 16. And together with my students here at the University of San Diego, we went and we sort of crawled through and scraped and grabbed every report we could on UAS uses in Google News, in sort of newspapers, in the Bard College has a center for the study of the drone. We scraped every single one of their newsletters and Motherboard and Engadget and sort of all these like tech places. We read every single one of their newsletters, went through every one of their websites and categorized all of that in one massive spreadsheet. And then we analyzed everything that was in that spreadsheet and said, is this new? Was it violent or nonviolent? Was it a corporation that did this, or was it a citizen? Did they say they had a reason, or was it a hobby, just for hobbyist purposes? And so that's where we get the big picture. And that's why when I say for this first wave of drone diffusion, most of the least likely cases were, spying and crime. And that leads me to feel optimistic that we can say, I can call the book The Good Drone, and we can talk more about its promise than its peril. All of that kind of confidence isn't why I wrote the book. It's actually what came from the data, and then I just wrote up what we found. And really that optimistic story, I think, is in the data. And I'm an optimistic guy, so so that helps as well. But it really was that data that led me to feel confident about the positive story that I'm telling in the book. And the second source of data then is we took some of the really interesting stories that we saw in the Excel spreadsheet, kind of, digging down at that little level. When we found stories that were really interesting, we wrote those up as case studies. I called the people who were in the stories, I interviewed them, and we really brought to life their stories so the reader can get a feel for what kind of decisions they were making and what their activity looked like beyond just the headline. And so one is we dug down into the data, although it's not in the book. If you want it, the data is available for free online, but I didn't want to bore anybody with the charts and the tables, so none of that's in the book. But we dug into that data, we pulled out the stories, and then in the book, we do our best to tell those stories.
I heard you say that you had a publisher for the book. So you didn't self-publish then?
Yeah, that's right. So the book is out with MIT Press. And so MIT Press is the leading academic publisher for books on technology, leading edge technology. So I was fortunate to be working over the last couple of years with a really smart editor and a sharp editorial team over there who, from the very beginning, as I mentioned earlier, I sort of had this book idea, and then it starts to grow. And then the original vision is maintained. I pitch the original vision to the editor. Editor likes that original vision and then makes suggestions like, why don't you write about balloons, right? And then I got to go dig up the history of balloons. So that was a really symbiotic relationship over the course of those years. It's in a series at MIT Press called Acting with Technology. And it's about humans and technology sort of work together in complementary ways, let's say. And so I had the good fortune of having the support early on of that team that actually runs that Acting with Technology series. And then they brought it to their editor at MIT Press. And through that whole thing, this kind of positive, empirically based positive story has continued to come through. But that team has really helped pull out some of those stories. And I've mentioned several times now, but additional technologies that I would have overlooked, saying, no, actually, those are an important part of the story if we're going to be talking about technology for good. So MIT Press is the publisher, and it's available everywhere, and they've been really a joy to work with.
Have you written other books?
Yeah, this is not my first book. Also out this year is a separate book. One of the things I've not mentioned is over the last 2 years or so, as I mentioned earlier, sociologist, I'm a social science guy. I read and write books, and I'm kind of that's my world. And over the last couple of years, I've been teaching a class with a colleague in engineering. Very different world. And we've been teaching classes about how drones can get used for the greater good here at the University of San Diego. And so what he's done is brought the engineering and sort of engineering sciences side of the perspective into the classroom. And I've brought the social and political, all the stuff we've been talking about, through the course of this conversation. I brought in these considerations, and then his students brought in their reflections on the sort of more technical and engineering side of the equation. So that's been really fulfilling, having my students, my social science students in the room, and his engineering sciences students in the room. And so we wrote a book about that whole experience. And so that book is also just launched this year, and it's called Drones for Good, Socio-Technical Engineering in the Classroom, or something like this. And so those are my two books on drones and drone technology. And then I have other books on human rights and social movements. I've written a number of other books. that you can find. If you find the good drone and you read the good drone and you want another book, you can keep looking. I've written other stuff.
What did you learn through the process of writing The Good Drone?
That's a great question. I mean, I think that even though I set out to write the book because I was struck by how little, violent and mean activity there was in that data set, that was really the first aha moment I had looking at the data going, wow, I've got these charts. I don't bog the book down with charts, but the charts are amazing. You could barely see the line where we counted how many folks are using this for malintent. And so what really did surprise me and catch my attention was that in the course of writing the book, how many cases, positive cases there were. And I thought maybe that was a fluke. Maybe that data was 2009 to 2015. And you and your listeners can correct me if I'm wrong. But I waited then to say, okay, maybe those were the early days. And post 2015, we say a huge uptick in activity. But I stand by this hypothesis, which is that most people, want to live in harmony with one another. And if we get into conflicts, it's for specific reasons and the conflict passes. I was listening to an earlier episode of yours and you're interviewing somebody who's offering airspace denial to capacity to prisons. And I remember them saying that the first couple of times, they were having this challenges, drones were flying in. And then once whoever it was that were using drones to deliver contraband realized that they were going to lose their drones and they were going to lose whatever was in the cargo they stopped doing it. And so even so I'm saying not everybody's a bad guy. Most people are actually good. And even the bad guys, if it just gets too expensive to keep doing the thing, then they're going to stop. And so I think in society, we tend to focus on, well, you know what? Folks are going to find a workaround to that. And that's not false. That's true. If there's a criminal activity that's making lots of money, they'll find a workaround. But guess what? Then people put up a drone shield around a prison, and then there's no more of this kind of illegal penetration going on. And so I really feel like my optimism remains intact. And I shouldn't say I was surprised, but I've been pleasantly surprised to see that while there are, one news story gets repeated 150 times at the base level, and when we really look at the data with a critical eye, people want to be good and people want to use technology for good, despite what a handful of bad actors are doing with the technology.
How do you think society will benefit by using drones in the future?
I'm a sociologist. We're really, really bad at predictions. You have to promise me you're going to delete this file in 6 months or something. But that's one of the puzzles I end the book with, is some kind of guesses about not future use, but how it is that new use might happen. So I argue, for example, that for technology to really get adopted, it has to be affordable. And I think that's one of the things that's really helped DJI and Parrot and a number of others really break through about 5 or 6 years ago, is they just had a great price point. It was just affordable. They were easy to fly and people could imagine buying them in many cases. So I think that sort of affordability is important, but there's this handful of other aspects. I won't go into all of them, but one of them is just whether it's acceptable and whether or not people think it's the right thing to do. And so for example, people for the ethical treatment of animals, PETA, they never have like a game shoot fundraiser. Why? People for the ethical protection of animals, treatment of animals, they're not going to have a game shoot fundraiser. But if you're the NRA, you can have a game shoot fundraiser, and that matches with your mission. So the idea here is, who is it for whom using a drone to do their work, their pro-social work, is going to be acceptable, if that makes sense. And I think one of the hesitations there is public opinion is just slowly, in the first wave, was really against this kind of drone technology in our, quote unquote, in our communities, in our sky, in our neighborhoods. But I think that's slowly evolving. But I think it's going to have to evolve a lot more before people really become comfortable with the idea of the ways that drones can be used for good happening on a regular basis in our communities. And again, one of the things I have hoped to have emphasized is it's every community's right to say, we don't want that technology in our community. So I'm not saying public opinion needs to change. I'm saying that those communities probably will make their own decisions. So looking forward, I think that there's going to be more and more folks using this technology for science and using it for R&D and using it for protecting the environment or protecting endangered species. But everything I just described right there are things that happen far away from populated areas. So I think the most sort of promising promising trend lines are going to be deploying this technology for good, where you don't have to mess with and be distracted by public opinion. And what's going to happen with public opinion, that's where I'm saying I'm no prophet, and I'd have a really hard time guessing that, because people are fickle, myself included.
What would you like those involved in social movements to know about drones?
I think that it's important for people, for citizens, residents, to have the tools necessary to hold the powerful to account. That's not a drone story or a new technology in the air story. That's just sort of a political philosophy that I personally committed to. And so I think we need governments, but I also think that we need counterbalance in the form of the people who are able to exercise our spending power, our votes, our voices, these sorts of things. So in my mind, the big opportunity for social movement folks is to think about how, I'm going to say drones here, but technology more generally can be used to hold the powerful to account. Not an example in my book, but a great example is we as a country are having, here in the United States, we're having a global conversation about policing and about equality because of the ubiquity of cell phones. This isn't because of the presence or absence of police relations or the presence or absence of people who have been abused. It's because cell phones are now ubiquitous and they're able to capture things that we weren't seeing before as societies. And so that's a great example of how just the simple ubiquity of a tool that wasn't designed with, police, civilian, or society relations in mind, but all of a sudden got used in this way. It's a great example of just how that technology has been used in a new way that nobody who invented the smartphone would have ever imagined. They wouldn't have said, I invented this for that purpose. So I'd like to think, and this is a vague answer to your very specific question, but I'd like to think that there is a similar future for drones and for airborne observation platforms, let's say, whether they're IR or cameras, etc. But I think there's an opportunity for the people to hold the powerful to account by asking new questions about how resources are spent, asking new questions about black ops sites, asking new questions about the American military's sort of footprint around the world. We have, 800 military sites around the world, lots of them not on Google Earth. So I'm not recommending people go fly UASs over black ops sites. I'm saying there's a whole host of things where this technology is going to get used creatively by people in ways that we can't imagine. And so I'm hoping not to dodge your question, but a great example is cameras and police brutality, digital sort of cell phone cameras and police brutality. And I imagine the drone has a broader life in its ability to do similar sorts of things. Copying that, I'm not exactly sure. I don't know if that's the right thing, but similar and into the future is sort of what I would hope for.
Austin, is there anything that we missed that we should talk about?
No, this was a great conversation. I really appreciate you asking questions, not just about what the book's about, but also how the book is sort of put together, the book as a thing. And one of the things I realized as I was writing the book is how much I love books. And it's an old technology, the book. But the book is something that's near and dear to my heart, just like the camera. So I appreciate you asking questions that brought out in me a love and delight for an old physical I love the bricky body of the book, and I love the materiality of a camera. And so I think that's something that I want to come through in the book is an appreciation for talking about politics and culture and change, but also a kind of childlike is the wrong way to say it, but a delight in the technology, a delight in the stuff that we can hold in our hands and talk about and look at and tinker with. And I think there's really something beautiful about that. And I think your questions brought some of that out in ways that other interviewers haven't, and I appreciate that.
And for my final question, Austin, what message would you like to leave regarding drones?
I think it's the fact that my new book, The Good Drone, is about how drones are being used to make the world a better place. It's about how new technology in the air changes politics on the ground and how they're democratizing surveillance. And there's also a whole bunch of cool stories.
That's it for episode 279 of the Drone Radio Show. I hope you enjoyed hearing from Austin Choi-Fitzpatrick and learning about his new book. I want to thank Austin for taking the time to speak with me. If you want to learn more about The Good Drone or want to connect with Austin, check out the webpage at austinchoifitzpatrick.com. The book is also available at MIT Press. If you like the Drone Radio Show, please consider supporting the podcast with a small donation. The content is always free, but for as little as $1, you can help defray the cost of production. To donate, go to droneradioshow.com/donate. And thanks for listening. Your support means a lot to me, and I hope you'll listen to more episodes of the Drone Radio Show podcast to hear how others are using drones for business, fun, and research. For the Drone Radio Show, I'm Randy Goers.
This has been the Drone Radio Show podcast. More information on today's show can be found on our website at www.droneradioshow.com. If you're using drone technology for business, fun, or research and would like to share your experience on the show, please visit our website and fill out a guest appearance application. And don't forget to follow us on your favorite social media channels.